Thank you very much. The same rules apply as last night. You should feel free to raise any kind of question you want, but just with a minor change is that you can ask any question you want up until, say, 9:15. Then I have to go back and continue to try to save the country from the East Coast. Tonight, the title of my talk tonight is How Much Can Discrimination Explain? Now, I'm going to be talking about discrimination so far as blacks are concerned, but keep in mind that what I say is applicable to other forms of discrimination, such as sex discrimination. And what I want to do is to try to suggest to you a way of thinking about issues having to do with discrimination or sex or race. Now, the most central premise of the civil rights vision, and what I mean by the civil rights vision is the vision held by many civil rights activists such as the NAACP and Jesse Jackson, and perhaps now for women. The most central premise of the civil rights vision is that statistical disparities in income, occupation, and education, and some other socioeconomic characteristics are moral injustices caused by society. That lies at the core of what you would hear if you were listening and paying a lot of attention to people who talk about civil rights. Now, underlying this premise are several assumptions that have assumed an axiomatic status. And what I mean by an axiomatic status is that these assumptions that underlie the civil rights vision are felt to be beyond question. That's what we mean by axiomatic. Now, let me just talk about, let me just briefly list the assumptions and then consider them. The first assumption holds that discrimination leads to adverse effects on the achievement of those discriminated against. And indeed, it is this assumption that forms the justification for the notion that blacks or women cannot make broad advances until discrimination is eliminated in the broader society. The second assumption of the civil rights vision holds that statistical differences between races imply or measure discrimination. And we're all familiar with that. That is, someone says, well, while blacks are 13% of the population, they're only 2% of the doctors. And so that is offered as evidence of this assumption that statistical differences between races imply and indeed measure discrimination. Now, the third and last assumption is related to the second in that it holds that statistical differences would not arise and surely would not persist in the absence of discrimination. Now, I think that this premise that I gave and the assumptions, I think that they correctly reflect the view of those that hold the civil rights vision. And what I want to do is to look behind these assumptions and see just how much they tell us. And I think that examining these assumptions will give us a better handle on effective policies. Because I think that the second and third assumption, namely that statistical disparities or evidence of discrimination, and the third, that they would not persist, formed the basis for considerable litigation calling for employment quotas and preferences and set-asides. Now we can examine these assumptions to see just how valid they are. And let's look at the first one. That is, that discrimination leads to adverse effects on the achievement of those discriminated against. Well, Jews have faced centuries of discrimination. And moreover, they found that that discrimination did not end when they came to the United States. But yet Jewish Americans, have high income and high education. And that observation alone would lead us to question the statement that discrimination leads to adverse effects on the achievement of those discriminated against, but more importantly, the assumption that says that discrimination has to be eliminated in the broader society before there can be broad advances by a group. Now, some people might say, well, Jews are unfair comparison because, well, a Jewish person can just change his name from Goldberg to Williams and just kind of melt into the woodwork. But what about Japanese and Chinese? They appear to me, at least, to be an identifiable minority, and they surely don't have the Jewish option of changing their names. Now, the Japanese and Chinese saw gross discrimination in the United States, which included alien land laws. That is, by 1910, 11 Western states had laws that said that aliens could not own land. And in 1876, I believe it was, the Oriental Exclusion Act was written. And then we remember in 1940s, during World War II, the Japanese were interned and their property was virtually confiscated to the extent that they had to sell at very short notice. But yet, according to the 1980 census, Japanese Americans have the highest median family income. They have the greatest percentage of professional workers. That is, in the nationally, 15% of Americans are professional workers. For Japanese, it is 25%, and for Chinese, it's 24%. Also, Japanese and Chinese have the lowest crime rates, the greatest marital stability, and the lowest alcoholism rates. Now, someone might say, well, gee, Williams, that's an unfair comparison because people have a special dislike for black Americans, so you can't really use Japanese, Chinese, and Jews. Well, if you look at West Indian American blacks, the median family of West Indian American blacks is slightly higher than the median income of Americans in general. That's in 1972. Moreover, the professional status of West Indian American blacks is slightly above the national norm. As I said, the national, the percentage of people across the country that are professional workers are 15%, and West Indian Americans are 15.6%. So the West Indian example can deal with the issue of blacks being able to make it in the country without the elimination of discrimination first. That is, I doubt whether a racially discriminatory employer will take time to find out whether the person is a West Indian or just an average black before he decides to discriminate. Moreover, the arguments that black Americans bear a special heritage of slavery, and that explains some of the problems. Well, West Indians were slaves as well. Now, we need not confine our analysis to the United States. We can look all around the world. And that is, you can go to Southeast Asia, and the Chinese are the discriminated against minority in Southeast Asia, constituting no more than 12–13% of the entire population of Southeast Asia. They faced massive expulsions and massacres over the centuries. But in places like Malaysia or Burma, Chinese own 60% of the GNP. They produce 60% of the GNP. In some of those countries, they have to have, or they've decided to have, affirmative action programs for the Malays, or set-aside programs for the Burmese. If you look at the Armenians in the post-Ottoman Empire, we recall that in 1910s, the Turks tried to exterminate the Armenians. The Armenians faced a lot of discrimination. But the Armenians in the post-Ottoman Empire have higher income than the Turks who discriminated against them. You can say the same thing about Jews in Germany. So these examples that I've given you seem to at least question the hypothesis that discrimination causes adverse effects on the achievement of those discriminated against. What I mean is, by the examples that I've given, and particularly in the international arena, that the discriminated against have higher incomes or higher socioeconomic status than the people who are discriminating against them. Let's talk about the second assumption that underlies the civil rights vision, and that is statistical differences, just statistical differences. Where the argument goes, but for the fact of discrimination, we'd all be alike. Now, I have some statistical differences that I would like to suggest to you, or to give to you, and ask you to think about what might they explain, what kind of story can they tell. Black Americans are 13% of the population. However, they are 75% of the NBA players, National Basketball Association players. They're the highest paid players. Now that is a considerable statistical disparity. And what do you want to make of it? I mean, are blacks conducting some kind of conspiracy against white basketball players? Or if you look at college games, I was looking at the NC2A, and I saw all 10 players at various times on the court blacks. Does that mean that there's some kind of conspiracy against white players and pity the poor Oriental player? I don't see any at all on the basketball court. You find the same thing in football. Blacks are 55% of the football players and 38% of the baseball players. So what do you make of that statistical disparity? I mean, can you say, well, these multi-billion-dollar firms such as the Los Angeles Lakers and the Philadelphia 76ers, they're just nice guys, unlike IBM and Chrysler and AT&T. I doubt whether that explains it at all. Now, on the other hand, I've just found out recently, I used to say we're zero, but there's only one black in the National Hockey League. And that's just been very recent. Now, so what do you make of that? That is, if you see just one black in the hockey league and 75% of the players in basketball are black, what do you make of that statistic? Do you say, well, the hockey league is racist and the basketball is just nice? And then, speaking of hockey, It turns out that there's another statistical disparity that you might want to be interested in, and that is slightly over 50% of all American hockey players come from Minnesota. And so you might wonder, well, what kind of conspiracy is Minnesota conducting against the rest of the 49 states? Another interesting statistical disparity is in baseball, 3 out of 5 highest home run hitters were black. Of the seven of the highest, let me go back. Of the 10 highest season slugging averages, 7 were held by German Americans. Of the 5 times more than 100 bases were stolen in a season, they're all by blacks. Or another statistical disparity. Jews are no more than 3.5% of our country, but 33% of all American Nobel Prize winners are Jewish. What does that mean? I mean, does that mean the Jews are hiding the books from the rest of us? What I'm suggesting is that we might want to question the statement that statistical disparities imply or measure discrimination, as is so popular in our thinking, popular in the courts, popular in the civil rights establishment. There's another interesting statistic or a similar question can be applied to male and female income differences. That is, people say that equally productive females earn only 59% of the income of their male counterparts. Now, one has to worry about that a little bit. But before I say why I worry about that statement, I'll point out another statistic along those lines. It turns out that unmarried men earn only 62% of the income of married men, controlling for age. So what does that mean? Does it mean that companies not only have it in for women, but they have it in for unmarried men as well? Now when people say, now you have to think about this, when people say that equally productive women make only 59 cents on the male dollar, what does that mean? What does that imply? Well, it implies that companies, in the name of the brotherhood and in the name of chauvinism, they are paying men wages that are 71% higher than they would have to pay if they would only hire the equally productive woman. That's 71% higher. Now, we all know that companies have wound up on the industrial trash heap because they had costs that were just 2% higher than the competition. Because if it were true that equally productive women were only making 59 cents on the male dollar, what would anybody do? They would go out and hire these equally productive women and run the competition out of the market, be able to bid them out of the market. So I doubt seriously whether all these women who are making only 59 cents on the male dollar, I doubt whether you can explain that through sex discrimination. Or I even doubt that they're equally productive as men. Now, before you condemn me for sexism, let me go back a little bit and explain some of the story. And what might help some of you young ladies, some of the older women, they're in the room, they're a little beyond help. They've already made a mistake. Now, Let me just throw out some statistics here, a few that are insightful. First, females who remain unmarried and work continuously from 18 years of age to 37 years of age, their income, their median income, is slightly higher than males of the same description. Moreover, another interesting statistic is that female professors who are unmarried and have never been married, who have the same number of years of education, has the same quality PhD, the same number of publications, same number of years of experience, their median income is $400 more than a male professor of the same description. That is a male professor who's never been married. Now, so the real tip for women is for them to recognize that marriage exacts a very, very high cost on women. It imposes a very high cost on women. Why? Well, because when a man marries, he gets a helper. And when a woman marries, she becomes a helpee. And there are different implications from those different roles. Let me give you an example of this. When I come home from work, I tell my wife to get me my slippers and my pipe and bring me my journals that came, and I just read while she takes care of my daughter and washes the dishes and stuff like that, all those traditional things. And my human capital continues. I don't have to inconvenience my development of my human capital by having to take my daughter off to school or taking her to a club or something like that. And so, but she cannot develop her human capital as well. And so marriage imposes a very high cost on women. Now, I'd like to also say to the women who are older and who have already made the mistake that you should recognize that unmarried men earn only 62% of the income of married men. And that shows you the advantage of having a helper. That is, I would say that to all you ladies who are married, that surely you tell your husband that you own 38% of his income, without question. Moreover, men who are married, they live longer, they have lower morbidity rates, fewer suicides, and other kinds of problems. And so, so marriage is a clear benefit to men, clear economic benefit so far as the labor market is concerned. So young ladies, if you want to have a higher income, just don't get married. That is the policy recommendation. But there are other benefits from being married that you might want to consider as well. Now, what I'm arguing, or what I try to argue, is that if discrimination does not have to be eliminated in the broader society before people can make broad economic advances, well then it's a resource allocation issue. That is, why spend resources trying to eliminate every vestige of discrimination if that discrimination does not pose an insurmountable barrier to upward mobility? You can just use the resources better. But more importantly, I think that when in a lot of my discussions on discrimination, I point out that we don't think very well on matters of race. The terminology is just very misleading. I mean, discrimination just does not explain very much in and of itself. That is, discrimination is an inadequate explanation of the problems that women face or the problems that blacks face, which is not to deny that there is discrimination, which is not to deny that it does not have any effect, but what I'm saying is I don't believe that it explains very much, and let me say why. Suppose you were to ask me, Williams, what was the cause of the Grand Hotel fire several years ago that led to a very high loss of life? And you asked me this question expecting a very good answer since I'm a professor. And I say that the fire was caused by oxygen. And what do you think of that? Now, some of you are snickering, and my response to you would be, had there not been any oxygen around, there would not have been a fire. What are you laughing about? Well, what's the problem of trying to explain the Grand Hotel fire by saying it was caused by oxygen? Well, oxygen is so pervasive that it alone cannot explain anything. That is, I mean, if you say the Grand Hotel fire was caused by oxygen, well, the Capitol Hilton was surrounded by oxygen as well, but it did not burn down. So, oxygen is just everywhere, and it alone cannot explain anything. And I'm saying the same thing about discrimination, that discrimination is so widespread that it alone cannot explain anything. And there are many forms of discrimination, all forms of discrimination, because let me give you some examples of it. There are some forms of discrimination that you might not have considered. When I was choosing a wife to marry, I did not give every woman an equal opportunity. I mean, I systematically discriminated. I didn't give Asian women an equal chance. I didn't give Italian women, Polish women, women that have criminal records, women that don't bathe regularly. None of my criteria would have met none of my, I was looking to set up a contractual relationship. And none of the criteria that I used would have met any EEOC validation criteria on hiring somebody. My wife hired me and I hired her. Now, some people might say, well, Williams, that kind of discrimination doesn't harm anybody. Well, I'd be insulted because because when I married my wife, I harmed other women. I mean, and some of you might think, well, I'm being a little arrogant about this, but it's true. That is, the only way I could not have harmed other women was to be the kind of man that only one woman would want. And that's obviously not the case. So the point is that whenever you choose, you reduce the opportunity set for somebody. And choosing requires discrimination. And matter of fact, what I like to do in terms of, for analytical clarity, I like to define discrimination solely as the act of choice. That is, when you choose, you discriminate. That is, scarcity requires for us to choose. And scarcity is the cause of discrimination. That is, when you chose to come to the seminar this weekend, you had to discriminate against other possible uses of your time. And you hurt people. I mean, the movie theater that you would have gone to, they're injured by your choice, aren't they? That is, they have lower revenues. So I think for analytical clarity, we can think of discrimination as solely as the act of choice. Now, there's other terminology that's used when we talk about race that's misleading as well. People talk about prejudice. Now, prejudice is a perfectly good word to use when we talk about race relations, but it's not clear what people mean by it. They kind of mix the concept. Now, I think that for analytic clarity, we should stick with the Latin derivative of prejudice, which means prejudge. And an economist can best understand prejudice as meaning making decisions on the basis of incomplete information. That is, you don't get all the information before you make a decision, you prejudge, or you use stereotypes. Now, in your sociology classes, the teacher will say, well, don't use stereotypes, it's not nice. Well, I have problems with that. Let me tell you why. Suppose after our lecture tonight, our discussion night, and you're leaving the room to go back to you're leaving this room to go back to your room or go and have a drink. And as you walk by that back door, as you walk out the back door, you see a full-grown tiger sitting there. What would you do? Well, I would predict that the average person would endeavor to leave the area in great dispatch. Now, that's an uninteresting prediction. But why you take that action is a little more interesting. That is your action, is your decision to run based on any detailed information that you have about that particular tiger, or is your decision to run based on tiger folklore, how you've seen other tigers behave, what your mother has demonstrated to you about tigers? That is, I predict most of you will stereotype that tiger. You'll use stereotypes. You will prejudge that tiger. Now, that's okay. Now, someone here said that, well, Williams, come on, I'm not prejudiced. I don't use stereotypes. Well, you would expect that person, when he saw the tiger, to get some more information about the tiger. You know, he would try to maybe pet him on the head, stroke him on the chin, and then, and only then, if he behaved in a menacing fashion, would he hit the road. But most people, when they see the tiger, they make a quick calculation. They say the expected benefit of an additional unit of information about that tiger is less than the expected cost, and so they don't search anymore. Now, so what we're saying here, and when we look at a tiger, what we're saying is that physical characteristics or cheaply observed characteristics can be proxies for more costly to observe characteristics. Let me give you an example of that, hypothetical. Suppose I have 20 people lined up right here. And let's assume that they're equal in height, they're equal in size, and the only way you can distinguish among those 20 people is by race and sex. They otherwise appear equal to you. You have zero information about any other characteristic. Okay, so there are, let me physically describe the 20 people. 5 are black males, 5 are white males, 5 are black females, and 5 are white females. Okay, so you have those 20 people sitting there, standing there. And I tell you, pick a 5-person basketball team, and if you win the game, you get $1 million. Now, how will you choose? How would you choose, the lady here? Okay, she'll pick the 5 black males, and ignoring the possibility that some of these guys might be Jerry West, some of the white guys. Okay, now, well, that's what most people would do. That's what a good Bayesian would do. Bayesian, the father of statistics. His choice would be dominated by the black males. But why? I mean, by watching her choice, can I say that she is a sexist? Because she didn't even consider the females. She just wrote those 10 females off.
That's based on personal.
Yeah, but however, the point I'm making, or can I, let me ask one other question and I'll follow up. Can I assume by watching this lady's behavior that she does not like white men? No, I can't. So the important point to this example I'm suggesting to you is that by watching people's behavior, it gives you very little unambiguous information about their preferences. That is, if I assume, if you have somebody like, if I have Governor Wallace, let's say, and he's going to choose, and if I assume that his objective function is to maximize his winning from the game, well, his choice will be indistinguishable from yours. And so, a person observing your behavior can make no unambiguous statements about preferences. Now, let's apply that to maybe some of the cases having to do with race or sex. Now, suppose you are an employer. Imagine you are an employer, and you're looking for a high school graduate as a trainee for some job, and you're looking for a high school graduate that would probably make 1,200 on the SAT, a combined score of 1,200 on the SAT exam. And it costs you $100 to interview a person. That is, each person you interview, it's going to cost you $100 in terms of your personnel costs. Now, if you are an employer and you're looking for such a person, would you send your recruiters to Newark, New Jersey's inner city schools? You probably would not. You'd probably, and why would you? Is it because that you have a distaste for blacks? Well, you may or may not. But surely one thing is true, is that you anticipate the probability of finding a successful candidate at the inner city schools in Newark, New Jersey, lower than the probability of finding a successful candidate in some suburban school. And so by watching the employer's behavior as he's searching, he's doing just like you were doing with the tiger. He's saying that, he's not saying that there's a causal relationship between race and SAT scores, but he knows that there's an associative one. Just like you did in the basketball case, you're not necessarily saying that there's a causal relationship between race or sex and proficiency in basketball, but you're saying that out there in this honest-to-God real world, I know that there's surely an associative one. And so the point that I'm trying to make to you is that physical characteristics can indeed be proxies for other characteristics that are costly to observe. And so the solution is not to stop people from being Bayesians or making guesses where they try to maximize the winnings. The solution seems to try to change the characteristics of the people involved in terms of their proficiency. So what I'm saying is that a lot of the terminology used when we talk about race is very, very misleading, and it leads to disastrous results. Or even the term, imagine, even the use of the word minority, like it's widely used and it's accepted, that's misleading, isn't it? Because when you say minority, well, implicit in that statement is, out there somewhere is a majority, right? Now, if you look at the American population, one of our characteristics is that we are a nation of minorities. That is, the largest identifiable ethnic group in America are people of English ancestry, and they are slightly over 15% of the population. The next largest ethnic group in America are people of German ancestry, and they're 14% of the population. The next is black Americans, 13% of the population. And everybody else are in the single-digit minorities. That is, Jews, Chinese, Polish, Armenian, Italian, Japanese, Russian Orthodox Jews, et cetera, et cetera. So even using the word minority is misleading. But a lot of people say, Williams, but But it's still all right to use majority because white people are white, and they're all Europeans, as if that was some kind of common basis. But I don't see that as common. I don't see white people as just as a single group, because I know from my history that white people in their homeland, in France, Germany, England, they've been trying to slaughter each other for centuries. And just since World War II, they managed to live at peace for the longest time in a long time. What is it, 45 years since the Second World War? That's the longest time they've lived in peace with one another for quite some time. And so you just can't lump all white people into one bag. So the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of the terminology is misleading, and it moves away from more useful analysis. Now, so what are some of the causes of the problems? What are some of the true causes of the problems that Black Americans face? Or what are some of the problems that I see? Well, there are a number of them. And they have very little to do with racial discrimination per se. Not saying, again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that racial discrimination does not exist, nor does it have any effect, but I'm saying the policy question is how much of what we see can be explained by racial discrimination. And I think very little of it can be explained by racial discrimination. A large chunk of the problems that Black Americans face is fraudulent education, which I alluded to last night. Grossly fraudulent education, where you find that Black students graduating from high school who take SAT scores, who take the SAT, score 100 to 150 points below the national norm, having a degree in hand. Moreover, that educational achievement deficit is not made up during 4 years of college, because all you need to do is to look at the performance on the graduate record exam, the GREs. And the GREs, Blacks average slightly over 125 points below the national norm. So that says to me that 12 years of fraudulent education in the primary and secondary schools cannot be corrected in 4 years of college. I mean, that is just whistling Dixie. Now, part of the solution to the education problem requires that we direct our attention away from pathology and begin to look at some of the islands of success where there's academic excellence among Blacks. And some of the success occurs in some private schools, mostly private schools, such as Ivy Leaf School in Philadelphia, West Side Preparatory School in Chicago, Marva Collins' school, many of the Black Muslim schools, Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles, and many of the parochial schools. At most of these schools that I mentioned, with the exception of the Black Muslim schools and the parochial schools, most of the private schools, which I would also throw in A. Philip Randolph School in New York, 85% of the Black kids who attend those schools read at and 3 years above grade level. The kids who attend those schools are from low and moderate income families. That observation should suggest to us several things in terms of finding a solution. It tells you, number one, that in terms of promoting Black academic excellence, we don't need to throw a lot of money at the problem. Because Ivy Leaf School, for example, its tuition is $1,750 a year. My wife and I, we're very familiar with that because we give 2 scholarships a year to the best students there. And this is in Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia schools, the per capita cost per kid in Philadelphia schools is $5,000 a year. Now, so that seems, I mean, it's a policy recommendation that you don't need a PhD economist to tell you. My grandmother could tell you. And the policy recommendation is to try to get as many blacks out of rotten, high-cost schools into lower-cost, better quality schools. It's an easy policy recommendation. You don't have to go to college for 9 years to find that out. So at least that says that money is not necessary to find a solution, but the educational establishment will always tell you more money. It tells you something else, too. It tells you that black academic excellence can be achieved without blacks having to capture a white kid to sit beside. And because none of these schools, and most notably the black Muslim schools, they're not into busing and integration programs. And moreover, I think that busing and integration, regardless of whatever merits it might have had, I think it's a racist concept. I think that it says that blacks cannot achieve academic excellence unless somebody goes out and captures a white kid to sit beside a black so that the black can maybe benefit from the aura of the kid. Now, if you go to these schools, what might explain the success of these schools? Well, I've walked into Ivy Leaf school any number of times. I've gone into black Muslim schools. I've gone to Marcus Garvey School in Los Angeles, A. Philip Randolph School. And you walk into the door, and you hear utter quiet. I use another term, but since we're on the air, since we're taping it, you hear utter quiet. You walk down the corridors, you see kids seated in their seat and actually looking at the teacher, and with pencils in their hand. You see the kids coming to school and they're actually sober. They're not cursing the teachers. They're not threatening the teachers. And that's all I see. There's no special programs, no song and dance routine. Is that these poor black kids, they need what anybody's kid needs for a high quality education. I mean, a parent that makes him do his homework, makes him go to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock at night on school nights, gets him up in the morning, feeds him a breakfast, and makes sure he comes to school in a business fashion, ready to learn. That's what you see. There's no mystery. And you need good, and another ingredient, you need teachers who know how to read and write themselves. Because a number of cases, teachers themselves have not mastered 9th and 10th grade reading, writing, and arithmetic. Matter of fact, in one graduate program, I believe at the University of South Carolina, public school teachers were going there during the summer for a master's degree, seeking a master's degree, and they were to become reading specialists. And they tested these teachers, and these teachers had not mastered 9th and 10th grade reading themselves, which is kind of gross, very gross. What are some of the other problems that black people face? There's a huge reservoir of racial goodwill in our country, and we're recklessly draining it with perhaps well-intentioned policy. And what we're doing as well is that we're providing kindling, a pile of combustible kindling, waiting for some racist arsonist, racial arsonist to set it on fire. That is to turn us against one another. Most of the affirmative action in our country is being practiced on college campuses. And it's no coincidence why you're finding an increase in racial incidents on college campuses. on college campuses that have had a long history of racial tolerance. I'm talking about Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, Oberlin College, colleges that have admitted blacks for a long time. They're having difficulty. Now, a lot of people will say that the reason why there are racial incidents on campuses is because of a tolerance, of an atmosphere of intolerance created by the Reagan administration. Well, they would have to explain, if they, using that hypothesis, they would have to explain why there have been more the racial incidents on colleges in the state of Massachusetts than the entire South. And Massachusetts, as you might know, is not widely known as Reagan country. So if I were the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, I would like a whole lot of these so-called affirmative action programs because they create resentment and help me in my recruiting efforts. But I think what we have to do as moral people in our country is that we have to reject them. We have to stand up and be counted. And I should also say that white people will have to develop some backbone and courage to stand up and reject this nonsense and not fear being called a racist. A lot of white people will accept a lot of nonsense because they're afraid of being called a racist. You know, let me just close with this point that I taught at Temple University, and they were talking about having a black economics course, which is utter nonsense. You know, demand curves for black people slope the same way for white people. But anyway, I was telling my department chairman, I said, now, if a Polish or an Italian student came into your office saying, well, we want Polish economics taught, or Italian economics, you would throw the crumb out on his ear, wouldn't you? But because a black says it, well, you give it, you give him an audience. I said, you need to have courage. Thank you very much.